afternoon and welcome to the Codes Fair and Farmers Market Committee for Tuesday, August 17th. We have two items on our agenda. The first is BL 2021-795 by Porterfield that amends the Metro Code pertaining to intermodal containers on residential property.
So moved.
I think we had deferred that last time so that we could get a few questions answered, and if you want to
You probably need to second the motion.
that's all right. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be recognized, and thank you all for taking a moment to have me before you. I know Councilmember Johnson had a few questions, and it's my understanding she was able to resolve those questions with codes. If you don't mind, Councilmember Johnson, if it's okay with you, Chair, if Councilmember Johnson, if you could maybe share out with the group the information you got from codes, and that may kind of help everyone.
So I sort of purged this from my brain because when I talked to Emily, it was like a done deal. So I was like, okay, done. So do you want to? You probably remember better than me. Okay.
So, Councilmember Johnson, I'm Emily Lamb from Codes. Councilmember, I'll give you a little background on how we got here, which is that Codes has gotten an increasing number of complaints from neighbors and residential properties about storage containers that people are purchasing and using for storage. I'm sorry, shipping containers that people are purchasing and using for storage. There's nothing in the code that currently prohibits that. We got some complaints in Councilmember Porterfield's district, so we reached out to her to let her know we've gotten these complaints, but we don't have any authority to do anything about it because it's currently not in the code. We're happy to draft some legislation if that's something that seems appropriate, given your neighbors and not only yours, but citywide residential district concerns. So she, I think, had decided obviously to move forward with that. So this is just a bill adding this to something that is prohibited within residential districts. When I talked to Councilmember Johnston a couple of weeks ago, one of her concerns was for what about houses that have active building permits, because they might be storing tools, or if they're renovating they might use it. And that is by policy and practice, really, codes, if there is an open building permit, that's just, we recognize that it's not temporary. I mean, it is temporary. This is not a permanent structure. So the goal of this bill is to prohibit permanent placement of shipping containers for storage. If we get a complaint and see that there is an active building permit, we can certainly talk to the property owner, but we would recognize that that is likely not a permanent structure. Building permits do have an expiration date, so ultimately, even if somebody was trying to beat the system, there's going to come a time where that building permit expires, so it couldn't stay indefinitely. I think that was your primary concern that we talked about, and I'm happy to answer any other questions. This isn't, yes.
So one of my questions was, and we mentioned this in the last committee, and we kind of made some theories, was about churches. Churches that are on residential property but allowed for church use. Would they be exempt from this or not?
So, church, if it goes to their fundamental mission, I would think that if the fundamental religious beliefs or religious mission, I would think that they probably are exempt from this. They're generally exempt from our zoning ordinances based on their, if it goes to their fundamental, if it's necessary for their fundamental, or necessary or fundamental to their essential mission. Then at that point, I think probably it would be. I mean, much like, it's a church in the middle of a residential district because that's where they're located and they're not necessarily bound to zoning codes. So I would say probably it would be permitted at churches if their testimony, for lack of a better word, is that this is essential to their religious mission, then probably it would be allowed.
And then two more questions. One, how do we determine, if there's not a building permit, that this is permanent on residential property? What's our timeline?
There's not a timeline. I don't believe it's written into the code. I think we would just say if there's not a building permit, we would reach out to codes, we would reach out to the property owner. I mean, if they tell us, no, it's just here because my grandmother died and I've got some extra furniture, we can work with them. And obviously when we abate property owners for violations of the code, we give them a reasonable time to come into compliance anyway. So if it's truly not permanent, if it is truly just a one-off because of grandmother died or whatever reason they've got to store something, if it truly is temporary, then by the time that abate period runs, it would presumably be off the property.
And so in the description, it says intermodal container, and you say shipping container. Does it cover pods or
Not if it's like a
dumpsters?
storage pod. I mean, there are like storage pods that you get from storage companies. I think that but those are generally temporary in nature if you're renting them. Intermodal container is just a shipping container. It's kind of like Kleenex versus tissue. Shipping container is kind of generic, is kind of a more specific. It's actually used on shipping. It's put on wheels and shipped.
Right.
An intermodal container may or may not.
For exchange ships, planes.
Right.
Super, thank you for answering all those questions.
I had one, just in terms of, well, actually two, but they're connected. So when we say long-term or permanent, what you're seeing more and more of, and this is something that we've been kind of talking about, I know you guys have had a bunch of conversations about it, because more than a year and a half ago, I was bugging Bill Herbert and John Michael about it. More and more development, building with shipping containers, homes, swimming pools, things of that sort. You're starting to see quite a bit of those being stored on properties, but not used for storage. It's because they're collecting a certain number of them and working toward building something of that nature. How do we separate that out?
Well, again, when we get complaints, we would go to the property and do an inspection. If they are building something out of shipping containers, they would be going through the building permit process, and we would have inspectors who would go out.
Right.
So, it would probably just be a fact-specific case. Like if we go out and it's just sitting out there in the middle of their grass.
But not being used for storage,
They're not,
right?
That would be different from if they're actually building with a shipping. I know one city, for example, has a bunch of shipping containers, and that's, that they got building permits and electrical permits and plumbing permits, and it's just the material that they were using.
So they would need to get a permit, because if it's not being used for storage and there's not a building permit yet, then it's materials. So it would kind of fall under, like, if you have lumber stacked somewhere or a concrete block stacked somewhere, if it's not being used for storage or until it's actually part of an active building permit, then it would just fall under materials?
I'm kind of having a hard time envisioning when somebody would have a shipping container on their property if it's not either being used for building or for storage.
Come to my district, I'll show you a bunch of them, especially in my
What are they being
rural
used
settings.
for?
Just laying around.
Yeah, because the intent is to get a design and do a build with it. So right now, it's not being used for storage or anything of that nature. They're buying them as they can get their hands on them or as they can afford to get them, and they're
Until they
I mean-
accumulate enough.
right.
for a
And then
project.
until they've gotten whatever they need to actually say, here's my design, I want to build X, and then try to pull a permit for it.
I don't think the code allows just open storage of materials. So I think at that point, we would say.
Right,
you're
so that's what I'm
just purchasing
saying.
this
Yeah, so I
and
guess it
storing
would-
For future use, that would probably be considered open storage
Right,
of
okay.
materials that we would abate them for open storage.
Okay, that's why I was going, if it would be considered as a material.
I think so.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I
No, you're fine.
had to get there.
While we're on these containers, I've gotten something, this isn't related to this bill exactly, but I've got, while we got you here, I want to ask you this. On the public right-of-way, like in a parking spot on the street, I've gotten conflicting information. I've heard, no, they're not allowed at all. Most recently, that people can get a 30-day permit, and it can be in the public right-of-way, or not like in a parking space on the side of the street.
That's gonna be Public Works.
Okay.
Codes doesn't deal with right away.
And just to, I think based on how you answered it, I know the answer to this, but, so you aren't aware of any complaints about storage, anybody complaining about or filing a complaint against storage units on church property?
I'm not aware. Bill Penn would be the better person to answer that question because he generally fields, complaints like that over property standards. Doesn't mean we haven't gotten them. It may well be just that I haven't been the one to receive them.
Okay, thanks. Anything else? All right, are we ready to move on our motion and vote for the bill on second reading? Or vote? Yeah. All right, all those in favor? We got 6 in here now. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? All right, so we approve 6 to 0.
Thank you,
All
Chair.
right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let me see if Councilman Rosenberg is.
I'll see if I see.
Okay.
Rosenberg's on.
That's what he was was hanging out there earlier.
All right. No, they wouldn't be looking at that.
Hey, next on our agenda is BL 2021-798 by Rosenberg and Benedict. It amends the Metro Code zoning regulations to limit animal services as activities permitted as home occupations.
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, thank you. Councilmember Rosenberg, do you want to?
Sure, this came from codes. It basically does two things. There's been, when we allowed home businesses for personal care services, there have been
Personal care,
Ultimately, this came from another, neighbors were complaining because of, excessive traffic and excessive visits and excessive customers. We didn't revoke the permit because it was errantly issued, because that was the zoning administrator's interpretation. We revoked the permit because the code specifically says for X number of violations of these
Right.
regulations, it can be revoked.
Of course.
Based on that, and there were neighbors, and they had, I'm sure y'all have all had cases in environmental court where the neighbors are helping, keeping watch and gathering evidence.
Oh, yeah.
That happened to be, brought that to us, we revoked it based on that bad act. That was what was appealed to the BZA, but ultimately, the determination of whether or not it was a, errantly issued permit didn't come before the BZA. But we did get complaints from neighbors because they said excessive traffic, excessive visits, excessive animals, what's the customer, et cetera, et cetera. So this was just an attempt to clean up, specify that personal care services applies only to persons and not to animals.
And just to be clear, because we're all covered up here, we might as well be talking in a tin can. The BZA actually reversed your revocation, correct?
The BZA, if I recall, I wasn't there, but if I recall, the BZA said that the permit was properly issued. I'm sorry, it was properly, well, they didn't get to that. The permit was properly revoked, but they basically just gave them a waiting period, similar to short-term rental waiting periods, and said after X a number of months, without operating, you can come back and reapply. So is everybody familiar with
Yes.
short-term rentals and how if it's revoked, then you?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So they basically just imposed a waiting period, which isn't in the home occupation law, but I think that's what they did.
but even if you allow it with the person going and getting the dog, you still have the same amount of traffic. And then if you've got an employee, then you've got 24 trips coming in and out of the house. And the whole purpose was to limit traffic. Come, get your hair done, leave. That's one trip for a
Two.
person. For a person.
One in,
You
one
can have
out.
6 customers.
No, one,
No.
right.
You can have 6 customers.
Right,
12
but it's
trips.
one trip to the house.
Yeah.
Because you're yourself getting your hair done or your
Right.
nails done or whatever you're doing. With a dog, even if it's the person, the homeowner themselves doing the grooming, going to pick up the dog, coming back, doing it, dropping it off, coming back, that's still the point is
Oh.
the
They wouldn't just
traffic.
sit, wait on the dog.
Well, I guess if
Right.
you live in a
No,
very.
because the person's not coming. We're saying there's two different things. Is the person coming to drop their dog off and then they leave, but who's gonna sit there for 2 hours or 3 hours? I'm not sitting there that
I'm not a
time.
dog owner, so I don't know how long dog grooming
It
takes.
takes about 2 to 3 hours. It takes about 2 to 3 hours. Nobody's gonna sit there.
Like
But the
person.
point is that if
Okay.
we're limiting the traffic so as not to disrupt the residential part of our neighborhoods with businesses, then it shouldn't be allowed, whether the groomer themselves and their employee is going to get the dog and bringing it back and forth, because it's the same difference. They have to go get the dog and come back, do the grooming, go drop it off and come back. It's still 2 trips.
Yeah. I would think that the customer is the one who's paying, and if the customer is making 2 trips, then, and that concerns me a little bit, but what I think could be a bigger problem, not just if it's an isolated event, instance, but if it happens a lot, if they're dropping off and, there's time after the services have been, the grooming has taken place, and they're, putting the dog out in the backyard for a couple of hours while they're waiting on the owner to come pick the dog up. I could see that being a problem, a nuisance.
So I found the bill finally after searching like 11 times on our site. So it amends personal care services as defined for home occupations to clarify that the definition does not include care of or services for animals. So if we were to pass this, then the services for animals could continue without exceeding the amount. Is that correct?
Wait, say
No.
that again?
Because it
Wouldn't
says,
allow it at all.
No,
it says that the
no.
definition does, it amends it to clarify that the definition does not include.
In other words,
The
it
code-
bans them.
So you
Right,
can't.
because they would,
Clearly bans them.
they would be excluded from the permit.
And let me go on public record as saying, dogs are people too.
I don't believe that, I just,
Don't tell that to my wife.
So that means.
it removes it
so
as
that-
a
so
permitted
Can
use.
I start claiming mine on my taxes and?
I wish I could.
Child credit?
As a.
A dog bite eats me out of the house at home.
A defendant, yeah.
You
Right.
start getting
Any-
250 a month.
All right, any council member want to be recognized for comments or questions?
Oh, did you say Roberts?
No, I said any.
councilman.
Oh,
And I didn't give you the-
But you do qualify as an any
I appreciate that. Thank
in
you.
the whole scheme of
In
things.
the big scheme of things, sure.
Anything else? Ready to vote? All those in favor of BL 2021-798, say aye.
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 That's two, I think. All those opposed?
No.
No.
I have to abstain. I didn't hear enough of the argument, and I apologize for being.
Okay, so I'm sorry, can we do hands? Because I think it's 2-4, but I'm not, or is that what it
Do
seems
we
like?
just all want to raise our hands? Or no?
Who's for it?
Wait, what?
And who's against it?
Jonathan? For or against?
3-3?
And who's abstaining?
I'm abstaining.
She's abstaining, so it was,
How did you vote?
it was 2 for and 4 against,
Okay. And one,
and 1 abstention.
4-1.
all right. All right, I don't think I have anything new for the group. Still waiting to hear about a fair board meeting, joint fair board. I know that the mayor's office and the BMI or BMS extended the time to work out the
Appointee.
proposal created by the letter of intent. And I think it's through I think it's to August 31st, I believe. So possibly, or late this month, early next month, we'll hear a specific proposal. And Director Womack will set up a meeting with us and the fair, this committee and the fair board, a public meeting. And we'll hear more and have an opportunity to talk about the proposal. Anybody else have anything? No. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms.
Thanks for being